We can't have a conversation about abortion, women's rights, or public policy without first talking about conception. So, in this video, I want to examine three worldview questions that, whether you know it or not, fundamentally shape your political and moral opinions about the unborn fetus. Now, before I ask those three worldview questions, let me just define what I mean by a worldview. So, a worldview is really just the lens we use to interpret the world and focus our observations into a clear narrative that answers the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. Now, obviously, the topic of abortion really hones in on that idea of morality, but really, a worldview answer will make sure that we address all four aspects of a worldview. So, what are those three worldview questions? Well, first, when does human life begin? Second, is every human a person? And third, is some life unworthy of life? So the two sort of broad positions on this when we deal with the topic of conception and human personhood are pro-life and pro-choice. Well, what is the pro-life sort of big picture perspective? Well, pro-life begins with God's truth that human life is sacred and human personhood begins at the moment of conception. But when does conception take place? Because even if we say it begins at conception, the question is, when does conception happen? So to answer that question, let's look at the science. Here we have a cross-section of a woman's body. We have the uterus, the fallopian tube, and one of the ovaries. Once a month, a woman produces an egg or ovum. At some point, the ovum becomes ovulated when it moves out into the fallopian tube. Now, in the throes of marital bliss, we'll just assume that's how it always happens here, the man's sperm travels into the woman's body and fertilizes the egg. This is at day 0. Now, by the end of day 1, the egg is fully fertilized and the two gametes are united as one. This is called syngamy. Now the fertilized egg continues to travel down the fallopian tube, and sometime between days 6 and 9, it implants in the endometrial lining of the uterus. All this to say, this leaves us with three competing ideas of when conception takes place. For pro-lifers, most argue conception is at day 0. Some, however, do argue that conception is at day 1. For most pro-choice folks, they argue that conception only happens after a successful implantation of the fertilized egg. Now, interestingly enough, for most pro-life and pro-choice folks, there is agreement that life does begin at conception. Now that may sound shocking to you, but let me see if I can show you why that's true. Medically speaking, Dr. Lejeune has a quote. This is an older quote, but I think it really summarizes well where this consensus scientifically is. He says this: after fertilization has taken place, a new human life has come into being. This is no longer a matter of taste or opinion. It is not a metaphysical contention. It is a plain experimental evidence. Now, this takes us back to the difference between the pro-life and the pro-choice worldview positions. Again, pro-life people begin with this idea that God's truth is that human life is sacred and human personhood begins at the moment of conception. But the pro-choice view begins with this perspective that human life begins at conception, but not personhood. So here, this distinction is pretty critical. This idea that medically, biologically, a human life begins at conception. Again, there might be some disagreement about what that point of conception is, but there is generally agreement that human life begins at conception. So conceptually, what the pro-choice advocate has done is say that the fetus is a human, but not a person. Now, this happens to be just a conversation I was having with a guy on LinkedIn. Somebody was questioning, is that really true? So I just put this because it's a first-hand conversation I had, but you can find this all kinds of literature where people make this same claim. He says clearly there's a difference between life and a human personhood. Life may begin in the womb, but human personhood begins with a fetus becomes a baby and draws its first breath of life outside the womb. This is true theologically and legally. So this is really the pro-choice view and the foundation that supports their advocacy for public policy on abortion rights. So this then really brings us back to those three worldview questions. When does human life begin? Is every human a person? And is some life unworthy of life? Now, obviously, that's not going to get answered in this short video, but I hope this introduction is a good place for you to start the discussion, dig in, do some research, and see how you think these questions should be answered. That's it for now. I hope you will take some time to consider your answers to these 3 worldview questions and prepare your heart and your mind for the next life-affirming conversation.